We study history to learn from the past, but what exactly is it that we're learning? Today we will be looking at 3 different approaches to studying history and unpacking some of the key concepts in each approach, so that we can better understand how to think about history. We'll also be talking about how these approaches have changed over time. So when we study history, there are really 3 things that we might be learning. The first is facts and information, such as names, dates, and places. It's the who, what, where, and when of history. We don't learn them individually and then move on to the next one. So for example, some teachers may emphasize facts and information more than others, or they may focus more on teaching students how to interpret sources or write essays. Also, some students may be better at memorizing facts than others, while others may be better at writing or critical thinking. For most of human history, people didn't study history at all. It wasn't until the 19th century that history became a formal academic discipline. Historians would write about the glories of the Ottoman past in order to make the Sultaness rule seem more legitimate. Confucius was seen as the ultimate authority on morality and ethics, and his teachings were used to justify the rule of the emperor. In Europe, historians often wrote about the glories of ancient Greece and Rome in order to promote a sense of classical education and culture. And in the United States, the lost cause mythology was used to glorify the Confederacy and downplay the role of slavery in the Civil War. They would also write about the supposed superiority of the Turkish people in order to promote a sense of nationalism. This was just one example. This is why those in power often tried to control the writing of history. These are all important things to learn, but it's important to remember that they reflect a particular way of studying history. This way of studying history has its strengths and weaknesses, and it's important to be aware of them. Ultimately, the best way to study history is the way that works best for you. Try different methods and see what works best for you, and never stop learning. This led to a more objective and scientific approach to the study of history. As always, you can find the references used in this video in the description below. And if you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to leave them below as well. We'll look forward to seeing you in the next video. Historians like Leopold von Ranke in Germany and Hippolyte Taine in France developed new methods for studying history based on the analysis of primary sources. It reflects the values and priorities of our society. That's why it's so important to be aware of the different ways of studying history, and to be able to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses. They also emphasize the importance of understanding the context of historical events. They wanted to make sure that the masses didn't learn anything that might threaten their authority, or many others. Even then, it was still some time before history classes became a standard part of the curriculum in most schools. But this way of studying history has also come under attack in recent years. Some scholars argue that it's too Eurocentric and doesn't give enough attention to the histories of non-Western civilizations. Others argue that it's too focused on politics and warfare and doesn't give enough attention to social and cultural history. Still others argue that it's too abstract and theoretical and doesn't pay enough attention to the particularities of individual historical cases. This is partly because history was seen as a subject for scholars and intellectuals rather than for the general public. It was also seen as a way of glorifying the nation and its past. This is why it's important for students to develop all 3 of these skills, so that they can be successful in history class, no matter what the teacher emphasizes. Rather, they all happen simultaneously and reinforce one another. If we want students to get good grades, it's important that they develop all 3 of these skills. So for example, knowing that Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during the Second World War, or that the French Revolution began in 1789. Facts and information are the building blocks of historical knowledge, and they form the basis for understanding the past. Well, it's because this way of studying history works. It helps us to understand the past, and it allows us to make sense of the world around us. But this hasn't always been the case. Without this sort of basic knowledge, it's impossible to interpret sources or even make sense of historical events. And you can't really go further than that in your studies without this foundation. The second thing that we learn in history class is how to interpret sources. This means being able to analyze primary and secondary sources and evaluate their usefulness in answering historical questions. This involves putting together the facts and interpretations that you've learned into a coherent and persuasive narrative. So, for example, if your teacher asked you to write an essay comparing and contrasting the French Revolution with the American Revolution, you would need to organize your thoughts and present them in a clear and logical way. You'd probably begin by stating your thesis, and then provide evidence from your studies to support it. For example, if I were to hand you a copy of Hitler's book Mein Kampf and ask you for your opinion on whether Hitler was anti-Semitic, you would hopefully be able to support your answer with evidence from the text. You'd be able to identify passages that reveal his prejudices and use them to explain why he wanted to exterminate all of the Jews in Europe. In other words, you would be interpreting a source to answer a historical question. And then finally, when we study history, we also learn how to construct arguments and write essays. Now these three things, facts and information, interpretation of sources, and the writing of essays, all tend to happen at the same time. However, it's important to remember that not all history teachers teach in the same way, nor do all students learn in the same way. But let's take a step back here and ask ourselves why we study history in this way. If we go back in history, we find that the way people studied history was very different. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, history was used as a tool to legitimize the rule of the Sultan. For example, in Imperial China, Confucianism was seen as the one true way of governing the state. The main point here is that history was seen as a way of promoting certain political or ideological agendas. This began to change during the Enlightenment, when there was a growing emphasis on reason and rationalism. This new way of studying history was eventually adopted by most universities and became the standard way of teaching history to students. Well, whatever the future may hold, it's important to remember that the way we study history is a product of the times in which we live. So when we study history, we learn facts and information, interpretation of sources, and how to construct arguments and write essays. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to stay updated with our latest videos.